Good afternoon, I'm Robert from El Magnifico Games, and tonight we are going to continue with our usual Wednesday poetry, prose, and riddles stream. Now, last week we were starting to read through Lord Byron's poetry. This is the gentleman in question. Well, I say gentleman, of course he was a lord. Lord Byron, a nobleman. The poem we finished off on was Song from the Corsair. So, let's begin with a rereading of that, and then we'll move on. Deep in my soul that tender secret dwells, lonely and lost to light for evermore, save when to thine my heart responsive swells, then trembles into silence as before. There in its centre, a sepulchral lamp, burns a slow flame eternal but unseen, which not the darkness of despair can damp, though vain its ray as it had never been. Remember me, oh, pass not through thy... my apologies. Remember, oh, pass not thou my grave, without one thought whose relics there recline. The only pang my bosom dare not brave must be to find forgetfulness in thine. My fondness faintest, latest accents hear, grief for the dead not virtue can reprove. Then give me all I ever asked, a tear, the first, last, sole reward of so much love. So the general themes of this anthology of love, love lost, death, and so on, is very much well represented in this particular poem. So, if there's nothing more to say about that, we will move on to Song from Don Juan. The Isles of Greece, the Isles of Grief, where burning Sappho loved and sang, where grew the arts of war and peace, where Delos rose and Phobos sprung. Eternal summer gilds them yet, but all except their sun is set. The Scion and the Teian muse, the hero's harp, the lover's lute, have found the fame your shores refuse, their place of birth alone is mute, to sounds which echo further west, than your sire's islands of the blest. The mountains looks a marathon looks on the sea, and musing there an hour alone, I dreamed that Greece might still be free, for standing on the Persian's grave, I could not deem myself a slave. A king sate on the rocky brow, would o'er see born Salamis, and ships by thousands lay below, and men in nations, all were his. He counted them at break of day, and when the sun set, where were they? And where are they? And where art thou, my country? Oh, thy voiceless shore, the heroic lay is tuneless now. The heroic bosom beats no more. And must thy lyre, so long divine, degenerate into hands like mine? 'Tis something in the dearth of fame, though linked among a fettered race, to feel at least a patriot's shame, even as I sing, suffuse my face. For what is left the poet here? For Greeks a blush, for Greece a tear. Must we but weep o'er days more blessed? Must we but blush, our fathers bled? Earth, render back from thy breast a remnant of our Spartan dead. Of the 300 grant but 3, to make a new Thermopylae. What, silent still and silent all? Ah, no, the voices of the dead sound like a distant torrent's fall, and answer, let one living head, but one arise, we come, 'tis but the living who are dumb. In vain, strike other chords, fill high the cup with Samian wine, leave battles to the Turkish hordes, and shed the blood of Sion's vine. Hark, rising to the ignoble call, how answers each bold bacchanal. You have the Pyrrhic dancers yet, where is the Pyrrhic phalanx gone? Of two such lessons why forget, the nobler and the manlier one? You have the letters Cadmus gave, think ye he meant them for a slave? Fill high the bowl with Samian wine, we will not think of themes like these. It made Anacreon's song divine. He served but served he served but served Polycrates. A tyrant, but our masters then were still at least our countrymen. The tyrant of the Chersonese was freedom's best and bravest friend. That tyrant was Miltiades. Oh, that the present hour would lend another despot of the kind. Such chains as his were sure to bind. Fill high the bowl with Samian wine. On Suli's rock and Parga's shore exists the remnant of a line, such as the Doric mothers bore, and there perhaps some seed is sown. The Heracleidian blood might own. Trust not for freedom to the Franks. They have a king who buys and sells. In native swords and native ranks the only hope of courage dwells. But Turkish force and Latin fraud would break your shield, however broad. Fill high the bowl with Samian wine. Our virgins dance beneath the shade. I see their glorious black eyes shine. But gazing on each glowing maid, my own the burning teardrop laves. To think such breasts must suckle slaves. Place me on Excuse me a second. Sorry. Place me on Sunium's marbled steep, where nothing save the waves and I may hear our mutual murmurs sweep. There swan-like let me sing and die. A land of slaves shall never be mine. Dash down your cup of Samian wine. So, what did we think of that one? I would note that Lord Byron, of course, joined the Greek War of Independence, fighting the Ottoman Empire, and died leading a campaign during that war. So it very much is very consistent that in this poem, which clearly he wrote before he died, he would he had the situation of Greece in mind. Greece, of course, having been conquered by the Ottomans. Well, I feel there's a lot of references here that I don't understand, so we're probably going to have to systematically go through them. Janice says, apologies that I don't quite get the general meaning themes of these short sections. I therefore check out the summary of this poem. Right, Sappho. That's the first reference I didn't get. Sappho was an ancient Greek poet from Eresos or Mytilene. Mytilene? Probably Mytilene. Obviously I don't know how it's pronounced. On the island of Lesbos. Sappho is known for her lyric poetry written to be sung while accompanied by music. In ancient times, Sappho was rightly regarded as one of the greatest lyric poets and was given names such as the Tenth Muse and the Poetess. Most of Sappho's poetry is now lost, and what is extant has mostly survived in fragmentary form. Only the Ode to Aphrodite is certainly complete. As well as lyric poetry, ancient commentators claim that Sappho wrote elegiac and iambic poetry. These epigrams attributed to Sappho are extant, but they are actually Hellenistic imitations of Sappho's style. So that's who Sappho was. Delos. That's the next one. The island of Delos, near Mykonos, near the centre of the Cyclades archipelago, is one of the most important mythological, historical and archaeological sites in Greece. The excavations in the island are among the most extensive in the Mediterranean. Ongoing work takes place under the direction of the Effort of Antiquities of Cyclades, and many of the artifacts found are on display at the Archaeological Museum of Delos and the National Archaeological Museum of Athens. Delos had a position as a holy sanctuary for a millennium before Olympian Greek mythology made it the birthplace of Apollo and Artemis. From its sacred harbour, the horizon shows the three conical mounds that have identified landscapes sacred to a goddess. It is predicted that the deity's name is Athena. In other sites, one retaining its pre-Greek name, Mount Cynthus, Mount Kinthos, is crowned with the sanctuary of Zeus. James says, I read some commentaries of this poem series. It appears that these works were regarded as immoral by the time when they were published. Oh, do you know why they were considered immoral? Oops. My apologies. Anyway, that's Delos. James says it was related to the poet's personal life. Apollo's chief epithet was Phobos, literally bright. It was very commonly used by both the Greeks and Romans for Apollo's role as the god of light. Like other deities, he had a number of others applied to him, reflecting the variety of roles, duties, and aspects ascribed to the god. However, while Apollo has a great number of appellations in Greek mythology, only a few occur in Latin literature. So that figures with Delos being the birthplace of Apollo. The Scion and the Teian. We seem to be out of luck there. And help us out. Jenny has provided a link to the poem Don Juan. Right at the beginning, in English literature, Don Juan by Lord Byron is a satirical, epic poem that portrays Don Juan not as a womanizer, but as a man easily seduced by women. But that isn't what this section, the song from Don Juan, appears to be about. I assume this is just one part of a much larger poem. If you think otherwise and would like to justify it, by all means. But I didn't see anything in this that seemed to relate to seduction, in that sense, romantic seduction. Yeah, we seem to be out of luck as far as Scion is concerned. So let's try Teian. Teo was a ancient Greek city on the coast of Ionia, on a peninsula between Chytrium and Myonyssus. I do apologise about my pronunciation, I know it must be dreadful. It was founded by minions from Orchomenus, Ionians and Boeotians. Bo Boeo Boe Boeo Boeotians. I'm sorry, I just can't. But the date of its foundation is unknown. Taos was one of the 12 cities which formed the Ionian League. The city was situated on a low hilly isthmus. The ruins are located to the south of the modern town of Sigahkeek in the Seferihisar district of Izmir province, Turkey. So, clearly an area which the Ottomans held. Jenny says, I think maybe the sense of romantic seduction is not explicitly expressed here. Still say look at 2. Maybe some hints can be found. The lover's loop. Possibly. Though equally that may be meant literally because a lot of Greek mythology dealt with love and romance. So I'm afraid I can't decipher what the Cyan and Teian muse is a reference to, other than muses from particular cities. I assume that they are known for a particular type of poetry, perhaps? I'm not sure. Oops, apologies again. Salamis. Salamis is the largest Greek island in the Saronic Gulf and 2 kilometers off the coast from Piraeus and about 16 kilometers west of central Athens. The chief city, Salamina, lies in the west-facing core of the crescent on the Salamis Bay, which opens into the Saronic Gulf. Okay, notable figures in Greek mythology were on here. Now the Battle of Thermopylae, that was the Battle of the 300, wasn't it? I assume this is again a reference to war, especially with the remnant of Spartan dead, and so I suppose the idea is that they want to make a noble, brave stand like the Spartans did against the Ottomans, I would assume. Yep. Yep, this is the one anyway. Talks about Semian wine quite a lot. Again, apologies for the pronunciation, it's probably awful. In ancient times, Samos was a especially rich and powerful city-state, particularly known for its vineyards and wine production. It is home to Pythagorean and the Heraion of Samos, a UNESCO World Heritage Site that includes the Euclidean Aqueduct, a marvel of ancient engineering. So that'd be why he keeps talking about Samian wine. Sire. Not sure. It's not clear what that is a reference to. Oh, the possible candidate, Chios, which may be the Sios he's talking about, was also a large exporter of Greek wine in the Hellenistic period. So that would also figure. Bacchanal is obviously a reference to the Greek god Bacchus, who was their god of overindulgence. Dionysus, which I think is the same god, but I will check in a minute to see why the difference in name, is the god of grape harvest, winemaking, orchards, fruit, vegetation, fertility, insanity, ritual madness, religious ecstasy, festivity, and theatre in the ancient Greek religion and myth. He is also known as Bacchus by the Greeks. This name was later adopted by the Romans. The frenzy that he induces is Bacchaea, as Eleutherius, the liberator, his wine, music, and excellent dance free his followers from self-conscious fear and care and subvert the oppressive restraints of the powerful. Your Pyrrhic dance. Well, I'm only familiar with Pyrrhic as in the general Pyrrhus, as in Pyrrhic victory. Pyrrhikios, or Pyrrhike. I'm not sure about the pronunciation. Sorry. Dance. It was the best known war dance of the Greeks. It is probably of Dorian origin and practiced at first solely as a training for war. According to ancient sources, it was a weapon dance. Interesting. So Lord Byron seems to be suggesting they still knew the Pyrrhic dance as late as his, when he was about. Which seems slightly dubious, but he was there and I wasn't. Jenny says, may I have one suggestion? I'm sorry if this is too far away from your plan, Rob. If you read the Wikipedia link, it includes a synopsis of each poem session you share here. In this case, my suggestion you read one poem session and then go to the synopsis so that hopefully we find it easier to understand the poem. Well, if there's something from the synopsis you think is particularly valuable, then of course we can read through it. But so far, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think we've had much difficulty reading through these poems. Just, you go through it in a slow, systematic fashion, and that's the stream. Or at least that's this section of the stream. Cadmus. Cadmus was the legendary Phoenician founder of Boeotian Thebes. He was the first Greek hero, and alongside Perseus and Bellerophon, the greatest hero and slayer of monsters before the days of Heracles. Commonly said to be the prince of Phoenicia, the son of King Agenor and the queen Telephassa of Tyre, the brother of Phoenix, Cilix and Europa. Cadmus could trace his origins back to Zeus. So what is the connection to letters? Okay, I think they mean letters as in the alphabet, and I think it's because Phoenician script appears to be the origin of the Greek alphabet, which in turn seems to have been the... I'm not qualified to say it's the... or I'm not knowledgeable enough to say that it was the origin of the Latin alphabet, but it was clearly the Greek alphabet, clearly very, very much influenced the Latin alphabet at the very minimum. There may have been other influences, I'm not sure. But the point being that here he's saying about Cadmus being the legendary Phoenician founder of Boeto. I don't know how to pronounce this. I should look that up. Boeotia. Sorry. So Cadmus being the legendary Phoenician founder of Boeotia, Thebes. That links him obviously to the Phoenician alphabet, and therefore he's saying, if this great king gave us these letters which we still use today, do you really think he meant them for a slave, as in the Greeks being slaves to the Ottomans? In the author's opinion, I couldn't say. I'm not particularly familiar with that period in history, although I do understand that the Ottomans weren't particularly kind to the Greeks. Cadmus is still revered and celebrated as a carrier of the letter to the world. Linear B tablets have been found in abundance at Thebes, which might lead one to speculate the legend of Cadmus as bringer of the alphabet could reflect earlier traditions about the origins of Linear B writing in Greece. But such a suggestion, however attractive, is by no means a certain conclusion in light of currently available evidence. The connection between the name of Cadmus and the historical origins of either the Linear B script or the later Phoenician alphabet, if any, remains elusive. However, in modern-day Lebanon, Cadmus is still revered and celebrated as a carrier of the letter to the world. So that explains that. Anacreons. Anacreon was a Greek lyric poet notable for his drinking songs and erotic poems. So, fill high the bowl with Semian wine, Semian obviously being the related to the city, which was well known for its vineyards in ancient times. We will not think of themes. We will not think of themes like these. It made Anacreon's song divine. Polycrates, son of Aces, was the tyrant of Samos from the 540s BC to 522 BC. He had a reputation as both a fierce warrior and an enlightened tyrant. He served Polycrates, a tyrant, but our master son was still at least our countryman. The tyrant of Chersonese. Is a name that was given to several different places in ancient times. The word is Latin. It derives from the Greek term for peninsula. So I'm not sure who he's referring to by the tyrant of Chersonese. Chersonese. But presumably that is another historical figure who was the tyrant, was freedom's best and bravest friend. That tyrant was Miltiades. Tyrant of Chersonese. Sorry. That's still probably horribly pronounced. Also known as Miltiades the Younger, was a Greek Athenian citizen known mostly for his role in the Battle of Marathon, as well as for his downfall afterwards. He was the son of Cimon Koalemos, a renowned Olympic chariot racer, and the father of Cimon, the noted Athenian statesman. Oh, that the present hour would lend another despot of that kind. Such chains as his were sure to bind. Sully's Rock and Perga's Shore. Okay, it's not clear what Sully's Rock is a reference to. I'm really not sure what he's referring to on Sully's Rock and Parga Shore. exist the remnants of a line such as the Doric mothers bore, as there perhaps some seed is sown, the Heracleidian blood might own. I'm not sure what that's a reference to. Trust not for freedom to the Franks, they have a king who buys and sells. They're presumably referring to Napoleon, or the author is. In native swords and native Franks, the only hope of courage dwells, but Turkish force and Latin fraud will break your shield forever broad, however broad. Synonyms. Cape Sonian is a promontory at the southernmost tip of the Attic Peninsula. Cape Sunian is known for its temple of Poseidon, one of the major monuments of the Golden Age of Athens. Its remnants are perched on the headland surrounded on three sides by the Aegean Sea. And hence the reference to the waves. Poseidon, of course, being the god of the seas. Where nothing save the waves and I may hear our mutual murmurs sweep. There, swan-like, let me sing and die. A land of slaves shall never be mine. Dash down yond cup of Semian wine. Okay, so I think we've got most of the references now. And unsurprisingly, they're all references to notable points in Greek history or mythology. So once again, I believe this poem, or this extract from a poem, is a call to arms to the Greeks who were at that period in time when Lord Byron was writing had been conquered by the Ottomans. Throughout the poem, Lord Byron compares them to slaves, and he's calling back to the times of the to the ancient Greek civilization with its many achievements, which it was believed at the time was the foundation of all Western civilization, that it all began in ancient Greece. And so, as I say, he seems to be trying to stir up, it would seem, feelings of rebellion within the Greeks against their Ottoman overlords. So, once again, the Isles of Greece, where burning Sappho loved and sung, there grew the arts of war and peace, where Delos rose and Phobos sprung. Eternal summer gilds them yet, but all except their sun is set. The Scion and the Teian muse, the hero's harp, the lover's lute, have found the fame your shores refuse. Their place of birth alone is mute, to sounds which echo further west than your sire's islands of the blest. The mountains look on Marathon, and Marathon looks on the sea, and musing there an hour alone, I dreamed that Greece might still be free, for standing on the Persians' grave, I could not deem myself a slave. A king sate on the rocky brow, which looks o'er sea-born Salamis, and ships by thousands lay below, and men in nations all were his. He counted them at break of day, and when the sun set, where were they? And where are they? Where art thou, my country, on thy voiceless shore? The heroic lay is tuneless now, the heroic bosom beats no more. Must thy lyre, so long divine, degenerate into hands like mine? 'Tis something in the dearth of fame, though linked among a fettered race, to feel at least a patriot's shame, even as I sing, suffuse my face. For what is left the poets here? For what is left the poet here? For Greeks a blush, for Greeks a tear. But we must weep o'er days more blessed. Must we but weep o'er more? I apologize again. Must we but weep o'er days more blessed? Must we but blush our fathers bled? Earth, render back from out thy breast a remnant of Spartan dead, of the 300 grant but 3 to make a new Philippoli. What silent still and silent all? Ah, no, the voices of the dead sound like a distant torrent's fall, and answer, let one living head, but one arise, we come, 'tis but the living who are dumb. In vain strike other chords, fill high the cup with Samian wine, leave battles to the Turkish hordes, and shed the blood of Sion's vine. Hark, rising to the ignoble call, how answers each bold bacchanal? You have the Pyrrhic dancers yet, where is the Pyrrhic phalanx gone? Of two such lessons why forget the nobler and the manlier one? You have the letters Cadmus gave, think ye he meant them for a slave? Fill high the bowl with Samian wine, we will not think of themes like these. It made Anacreon's song divine, he served but served Polycrates, a tyrant, but our masters then were still at least our countrymen. The tyrant of the Chersonese was freedom's best and bravest friend. That tyrant was Miltiades. Oh, that the present hour would lend another despot of the kind. Such chains as his was sure to bind. Such chains as his were sure to bind. Fill high the bowl with Samian wine. On Suli's rock and Parga's shore exists a remnant of a line, such as the Doric mothers bore, and there perhaps some seed is sown, that Heracleidian blood might own. Trust not for freedom to the Franks. They have a king who buys themselves, in native swords and native ranks the only hope of courage dwells, but Turkish force and that in fraud would break your shield however broad. Fill high the bowl with Samian wine, our virgins dance beneath the shade, I see their glorious black eyes shine, but gazing on each glowing maid, my own the burning teardrop laves, to think such breasts must suckle slaves. Place me on the Sunium's marbled steep, where nothing save the waves and I may hear our mutual murmurs sweep. There swan-like let me sing and die, a land of slaves shall never be mine, dash down yon cup of Samian wine. Oh, I do apologise, I struggled a bit with that reading in places. So, after having gone through it, looked up all the references, does anyone in chat have any more questions or concerns about this poem? Okay, if not, then I think I will attempt to read it once more. I can't promise I will do any better, but I'd like to try. If you think of anything you'd like to ask while I'm reading it, just put it in chat and I will read it when I've finished. So I will try once more. The Isles of Greece, where burning Sappho loved and sung, where grew the arts of war and peace, where Delos rose and Phobos sprung. Eternal summer gilds them yet, but all except their sun is set. The Scion and the Teian muse, the hero's harp, the lover's lute, have found the fame your shores refuse, their place of birth alone is mute, to sounds which echo further west than your sire's islands of the blest. The mountains look on Marathon, and Marathon looks on the sea, and musing there an hour alone I dreamed that Greece might still be free. For standing on the Persian's grave I could not deem myself a slave. A king sate on the rocky brow which look o'er sea-pond Salamis, and ships by thousands lay below, all men in nations, all were his. He counted them at break of day, and when the sun set, where were they? And where are they, and where art thou? My country, on thy voiceless shore, the heroic lay is tuneless now, the heroic bosom beats no more. And must thy lyre so long divine degenerate into hands like mine? 'Tis something in dearth of fame, Though linked among a fettered race, to feel at least a patriot's shame, even as I sing, suffuse my face, for what is left the poet here, for Greeks a blush, for Greece a tear. Must we but weep o'er days more blessed? Must we but blush our fathers bled? Earth, render back from out thy breast a remnant of Spartan dead. Of the 300, grant but 3 to make a new Philopoli. What silent still and silent all? Ah, no, the voices of the dead. Sounds like a distant torrent's fall. An answer, let one living head but one arise, we come, we come. 'Tis but the living who are dumb. In vain, strike other chords, fill high the cup with Samian wine, leave battles to the Turkish hordes, and shed the blood of Zion's vine. Hark, rising to the ignoble call, how answers each bold bacchanal. You have the Pyrrhic dancers yet, where is the Pyrrhic phalanx gone? Of 2 such lessons why forget the nobler and the manlier one? You have the letters Cadmus gave, think ye he meant them for a slave? Fill high the bowl with Samian wine, we will not think of themes like these. It made Anacreon's song divine, he served but served Polycrates, a tyrant, but our masters then was still at least our countryman. The tyrant of the Chersonese was freedom's best and bravest friend, that tyrant was Miltiades. Or that the present hour would lend another despot of the kind, such chains as his were sure to bind. Fill high the bowl with Samian wine, on Stuli's rock and Parga's shore exists a remnant of a line such as the Doric mothers bore, and there perhaps some seed is sown that Heracleidian blood might own. 'Twas not for freedom to the Franks, they have a king who buys and sells, in native swords and native ranks the only hope of courage dwells, but Turkish force and Latin fraud would break a shield however broad. Fill high the bowl with Samian wine, our virgins dance beneath the shade, I see their glorious black eyes shine, but gazing on each glowing maid, my own the burning teardrop laves, to think such breasts must suckle slaves. Place me on Sumium's marbled steep, where nothing save the waves and I may hear our mutual murmurs sweep. There swan-like let me sing and die, a land of slaves shall never be mine, dash down you cup of Samian wine. My apologies, dash down yon cup of Samian wine. So yes, I think we've correctly nailed down what the poem is about. Seems quite straightforward. I must say, I did really quite like it. At least once I understood it. It clearly had a rhyming scheme. A B A B C C A B A B C C A B A B C C A B A B C C and so on, which was very impressive. I don't think there was a full meter though. Actually, I think each line might have exactly 8 syllables. If that's the case, then that's very impressive. I think, I could be just completely and utterly mistaken about how meters work, but if meters are supposed to follow a specific pattern of emphasis, then I'd suggest that on the rules it out, because you wouldn't emphasize either on or the But yes, I haven't looked through the entire thing, and I won't for time's sake, but it looks like most of these lines, if not all, are exactly 8 syllables long, and it follows a rhyming scheme. And of course you've got all the references to mythology and ancient Greek history. Overall, a very impressive piece of poetry, I would say. Any final thoughts before we move on? Okay. If not, then we will move on to Pride and Prejudice. Now, of course, the first... Jenny says, I think there is not much room for discussion. Fair enough. Jenny says, because it seems it is a poem like a recording of the poet's life. I don't think that was supposed to be reflecting events in his life so much as his opinions. Since, of course, it is mostly a call to arms. At least it seems to be. So, Pride and Prejudice. I will, as always, recap what has happened so far. In the first chapter, we meet the Bennets. There's Mr. and Mrs. Bennet and the 5 daughters, Jane, Elizabeth, Mary, Catherine, also known as Kitty, and Lydia. We also learn that Mr. Bingley is moving into Netherfield, which is a local house. In chapter 2, we learn a bit about Mr. Bennet's sense of humour, in that he begins the social relationship between the Bennets and the Bingleys by visiting Mr. Bingley, but doesn't tell his family. Even though they had asked him to do so, he doesn't reveal that he has done so. In chapter 3, we learn more of Mr. Bennet's sense of humour, in that he will not provide a satisfactory description of what Mr. Bingley is like, despite the fact that his daughters are very much interested, as they wish to get married, and their mother wishes to see them get married, so she's also interested. We also see that the visit that Mr. Bennet made to Mr. Bingley is returned, and Mr. Bingley visits Mr. Bennet. A ball is held later on in the chapter, and we are introduced to the Hursts, who are Mr. Hurst and Mrs. Hurst, Mrs. Hurst being a sister of Mr. Bingley. We also meet Mr. Darcy, who is sitting out of the dance, which is somewhat unsociable, and then slights Elizabeth, which is remarked upon. Initially, he was considered to be a very desirable gentleman in the room, until he, in various ways, singled himself out to be, in other people's views, arrogant, and he very quickly became unpopular. Upon returning from the ball, we also find Mr. Bennet being, we might say, aggressively indifferent to the events of the ball. Although he's happy that his family's had a good time, he's not in the least bit interested in the gossip. In chapter 4, we see Jane and Elizabeth talking, in particular about the difference in character between Mr. Darcy and Mr. Bingley. In chapter 5, we're introduced to the Lucases, who were in attendance at the ball, but I don't believe they were mentioned before then, and we learn that Charlotte Lucas is a very good friend of Elizabeth Bennet. In chapter 6, we find out that Mr. Darcy is in fact falling in love with Elizabeth, despite the fact that he had previously slighted her at the ball. In chapter 7, we find out that Catherine and Lydia Bennet regularly visit Mrs. Phillips in Meryton. I believe Mrs. Phillips is Mrs. Bennet's sister, if I recall correctly. I may be wrong about that. They learn that soldiers are being stationed in Meryton, a fact which very much interests them, as they seem interested in men in uniform. And Jane travels to Netherfield, but she was denied the use of the carriage because her mother claimed that it wasn't available, but in reality she thought it would rain and that Jane would become ill and have to stay at Netherfield, which might cause a romance to blossom between her and Mr. Bingley. I believe up to that point they had expressed not necessarily a romantic interest in each other, but they seem to be getting on well. That is in fact what happens. Jane ends up having to take a horse and she's rained on and she becomes ill and has to stay at Netherfield. The following day Elizabeth walks to Netherfield to see her and she stays the night. In chapter 6, Elizabeth is being treated as an odd one out at Netherfield, partly because they think it's so extraordinary that she would walk on her own through fields for miles to see her sister, something they think is very improper very unsensible and very improper for someone of her station. She also gets singled out because she'd rather read books and play cards with the others. We also learn in that chapter a bit about Mr. Darcy's high standards for women, and we also see that the various people at Netherfield agree that the apotheker Mr. Jones should be sent for in the morning to look at Jane, who hasn't improved. In chapter 9, the Bennets visit Jane at Netherfield. Her mother thinks that she doesn't seem too ill and will recover, and so she decides to claim that she is too ill to be moved, so that she stays at Netherfield, still in this hope that some sort of romance will develop between her and Mr. Bingley. The apotheker visits and agrees with her that she shouldn't be moved. We also see a discussion between the guests and the hosts, in which Lydia Bennet pressures Mr. Bingley into keeping a promise to hold a ball. Lydia is hoping that the local soldiery will be in attendance to said ball. In chapter 10 we see that Jane is on the mend, and we see more of the difference between Mr. Bingley and Mr. Darcy's stress via an analogy to letter writing, as Mr. Darcy was writing a letter, and the way in which the two of them would approach writing a letter differently becomes the focus of a conversation. Mr. Darcy Mr. Darcy tries to dance with Elizabeth, though he is refused. Whilst going for a walk with Mrs. Hurst, Elizabeth ends up bumping into Miss Bingley and Mr. Darcy. This ultimately results in the three, Mrs. Hurst, Miss Bingley and Mr. Darcy, walking together and Elizabeth walking off on her own. In chapter 11 we see that Jane has much recovered, and Elizabeth tries to see that they both leave as early as possible. Jane has much recovered at this point. I think I skipped ahead slightly with the other point. We also see Miss Bingley trying to persuade yes, that's correct. Miss Bingley tries to persuade Mr. Bingley not to hold the ball, Miss Bingley, which fails, and Miss Bingley tries to catch Mr. Darcy's attentions via a turn about the room and ropes Elizabeth in two, which also fails. In chapter 12 we see Elizabeth trying to convince Jane that they should leave as early as possible, which Jane seems happy with. They write to their mother for the carriage, which is refused, as their mother wants Jane to stay there longer, again with this idea of a romance blossoming. After many this then leads to them requesting the Netherfield carriage, and after many professions of concern, this leads to them deferring their leaving until the following morning. Mr. Bingley tries to persuade Jane to stay even longer, but ultimately relents, and then the sisters return home after Sunday morning service, although their mother is not pleased. In chapter 13 we find out that a gentleman is visiting the Bennets, a Mr. Collins, who is to inherit Longbourn, their house, and he is in fact the cousin of Mr. Bennet. We also learn that he has been ordained, fairly recently it would seem, and that he is a patron in Lady Catherine de Bourgh. In chapter 14 we see Mr. Collins and the Bennet family at dinner. Mr. Collins reveals that he lives near his patroness and that she is a sickly daughter. We learn that Mr. Bennet thinks Mr. Collins absurd. It's also revealed that Mr. Collins never reads novels and that he finds the thought quite unpleasant. Mr. Collins is offended by Lydia interrupting him 3 pages into a book of Fordyce's sermons, and he offers himself as an antagonist to Mr. Bennet at backgammon instead of subjecting the family to the sermons. In chapter 15 we learn that Mr. Collins intends to marry one of the Bennet daughters, though they don't know it at this stage. Mrs. Bennet convinces him to change his mind from Jane, the eldest daughter, to one of the other daughters, in fact Elizabeth, as she reveals that Jane may be due to be married in the near future. Again, she's thinking of Mr. Bingley. Mr. Bennet insists that Mr. Collins joins his daughters in a trip to Meryton, just to be rid of him. Mr. Denny and Mr. Wickham, who are 2 army officers, meet the party in Meryton on the street. They happen to bump into each other, and at the same time Mr. Darcy and Mr. Bingley approach from a carriage, seeing the young ladies, but they seem a bit put off by the presence of Mr. Wickham, something which nobody else can explain or understand aside from, it would seem, Mr. Wickham. We also see that Mr. Wickham is invited to dinner at Mrs. Phillips' house the following evening. That is, along with the Bennet party, consisting of the Bennet daughters and Mr. Collins. In chapter 16, we learn that Mr. Wickham explains that the late Mr. Darcy, that is, the Mr. Darcy we know about's father, was his godfather and bequeathed him the next presentation of the best living, which presumably means a parish, as he reveals that he was educated with a view to him going into the church. The young Mr. Darcy, the one we know, denies this. Apparently there was informalities in the way his will was written, which meant that Mr. Wickham had no legal recourse. He couldn't force the young Mr. Darcy to provide him with the parish which he felt that the late Mr. Darcy's will made very clear was intended for him. That's ultimately what led him to go into the army. We also learn that Lady Catherine de Bourgh, the patroness of Mr. Collins, and Lady Anne Darcy are sisters. And it is believed that Darcy will marry Miss de Bourgh, that is the daughter of Lady Catherine de Bourgh. So, in other words, despite Mrs. Bingley's attempts to catch Mr. Darcy's attentions, it would appear that he is already spoken for. And those events, the ones I described in chapter 16, all happened at Mrs. Phillips' house. So that brings us up to where we are now. Are there any questions before we begin chapter 17? Very well, and we will begin. Elizabeth related to Jane the next day what had passed between Mr. Wickham and herself. Jane listened with astonishment and concern. She knew not how to believe that Mr. Darcy could be so unworthy of Mr. Bingley's regard, and yet it was not in her nature to question the veracity of a young man of such amiable appearance as Wickham. The possibility of his having endured such unkindness was enough to interest all her tender feelings, and nothing remained therefore to be done but to think well of them both, to defend the conduct of each, and throw into the account of accident or mistake whatever could not be otherwise explained. They have both, said she, been deceived, I dare say, in some way or other, of which we can form no idea. Interested people have perhaps misrepresented each to the other. It is in short impossible for us to conjecture the causes or circumstances which may have alienated them, without actual blame on either side. Very true indeed. And now, my dear Jane, what have you got to say on behalf of the interested people who have probably been concerned in the business? Do clear them too, or we shall be obliged to think ill of somebody. Laugh as much as you choose, but you will not laugh me out of my opinion, my dearest Lizzie. Do but consider in what a disgraceful light it places Mr. Darcy to be treating his father's favourite in such a manner, one whom his father had promised to provide for. It is impossible. No man of common humanity, no man who had any value for his character could be capable of it. Can his most intimate friends be so excessively deceived in him? Oh no. I can much more easily believe Mr. Bingley's being imposed on them, than that Mr. Wickham should invent such a history of himself as he gave last night. Names, facts, everything mentioned without ceremony. If it be not so, let Mr. Darcy contradict it. Besides, there was truth in his looks. It is difficult indeed, it is distressing. One does not know what to think. I beg your pardon, one knows exactly what to think. But Jane could think with certainty on only one point, that Mr. Bingley, if he had been imposed on, would have much to suffer when the affair became public. The two young ladies were summoned from the shrubbery where this conversation passed by the arrival of the very persons of whom they had been speaking. Mr. Bingley and his sisters came to give their personal invitation for the long-expected ball at Netherfield, which was fixed for the following Tuesday. The two ladies were delighted to see their dear friend again, and called it an age since they had met, and repeatedly asked what she had been doing with herself since their separation. To the rest of the family they paid little attention, avoiding Mrs. Bennet as much as possible, saying not much to Elizabeth, and nothing at all to the others. They were soon gone again, rising from their seats with an activity which took their brother by surprise, and hurrying off as if eager to escape from Mrs. Bennet's civilities. The prospect of the Netherfield ball was extremely agreeable to every female of the family. Mrs. Bennet chose to consider it as given in compliment to her eldest daughter, and was particularly flattered by receiving the invitation from Mr. Bingley himself, instead of a ceremonious card. Jane pictured to herself a happy evening in the society of her two friends, and the attentions of their brother, and Elizabeth thought with pleasure of dancing a great deal with Mr. Wickham, and of seeing a confirmation of everything in Mr. Darcy's look and behaviour. The happiness anticipated by Catherine and Lydia depended less on any single event or any particular person, for though they each, like Elizabeth, meant to dance half the evening with Mr. Wickham, it was by no means the only partner who could satisfy them, and a ball was, at any rate, a ball, and even Mary could assure her family that she had no disinclination for it. While I can have my mornings to myself, said she, it is enough, I think, it is no sacrifice to join occasionally in evening engagements. Society has claims on us all, and I profess myself one of those who consider intervals of recreation and amusement as desirable for everybody. Elizabeth's spirits were so high on this occasion that though they did not often speak unnecessarily to Mr. Collins, she could not help asking him whether he intended to accept Mr. Bingley's invitation, and if he did, whether he would think it proper to join in the evening's amusement, and she was rather surprised to find that he entertained no scruple whatever on that head, and was very far from dreading a rebuke either from the Archbishop or Lady Catherine de Bourgh by venturing to dance. "I'm by no means of the opinion, I assure you," said he, "that a ball of this kind, given by a young man of character to respectable people, could have any evil tendency. I am so far from objecting to dancing myself that I shall hope to be honoured with the hands of all my fair cousins in the course of the evening. I take the opportunity of soliciting yours, Miss Elizabeth, for the two first dances especially. a preference which I trust my cousin Jane will attribute to the right cause and not to any disrespect for her. Elizabeth felt herself completely taken in. She had fully proposed being engaged by Mr. Wickham for those very dances, and to have Mr. Collins instead. Her liveliness had never been worse timed. There was no help for it, however. Mr. Wickham's happiness and her own were perforce delayed a little longer, and Mr. Collins' proposal accepted as good as grace as she could. She was not the better pleased with his gallantry from the idea it suggested of something more. It now first struck her that she was selected from among her sisters as worthy of being mistress of Hunsford Parsonage, and of assisting to form a quadrille table at Rosings, in the absence of more eligible visitors. The idea soon reached to conviction, as she observed his increasing civilities towards her, and heard his frequent attempt at a compliment on her wit and vivacity. And though more astonished than gratified herself by this effect on her of her charms, it was not long before her mother gave her to understand that the probability of their marriage was extremely agreeable to her. Elizabeth, however, did not choose to take the hint, being well aware that a serious dispute must be the consequence of any reply. Mr. Collins might never make the offer. Until he did, it was useless to quarrel about him. If there had not been a Netherfield ball to prepare for and talk of, the younger Miss Bennets would have been in a very pitiable state at this time, for from the day of the invitation to the ball there was such a succession of rain as prevented their walking to Meryton once. No aunt, no officers, no news could be sought after. The very shoe roses for Netherfield were got by proxy. Even Elizabeth might have found some trial of her patience in the weather, which totally suspended the improvement of her acquaintance with Mr. Wickham, and nothing less than a dance on Tuesday could have made such a Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and Monday endurable to Kitty and Lydia. So, is there anything we'd like to discuss before I move on to Chapter 18? I suppose not. So, Chapter 18. Till Elizabeth entered the drawing-room at Netherfield, and looked in vain for Mr. Wickham among the cluster of redcoats there assembled, a doubt of his being present had never occurred to her. The certainty of meeting him had not been checked by any of those recollections that might not unreasonably have alarmed her. She had dressed with more than usual care, and prepared in the highest spirits for the conquest of all that remained unsubdued of his heart, trusting that it was not more than might be won in the course of the evening. But in an instant arose the dreadful suspicion of his being purposely omitted for Mr. Darcy's pleasure in the Bingleys' invitation to the officers, and though this was not exactly the case, the absolute fact of his absence was pronounced by his friend Denny, to whom Lydia eagerly applied, and who told them that Wickham had been obliged to go to town on business the day before, and was not yet returned, adding with a significant smile, "I do not imagine his business would have called him away just now, if he had not wanted to avoid a certain gentleman here." This part of his intelligence, though unheard by Lydia, was caught by Elizabeth, and as it assured her that Darcy was not less answerable for Wickham's absence than if her first surmise had been just, every feeling of displeasure against the former was so sharpened by the immediate disappointment that she could hardly reply with tolerable civility to the polite inquiries that she could hardly reply with tolerable civility to the polite inquiries which he directly afterwards approached to make. Attendance, forbearance, patience with Darcy was injury to Wickham. She was resolved against any sort of conversation with him, and turned away with a degree of ill humour which she could not wholly surmount even in speaking to Mr. Bingley, whose blind partially provoked her. I assume by whose blind partially provoked her, she means blindness to Mr. Darcy's nature. I could be wrong. Otherwise I don't fully understand that sentence. But Elizabeth was not formed for ill humour, and though every prospect of her own was destroyed for the evening, it could not dwell long on her spirits, and having told all her griefs to Charlotte Lucas, whom she had not seen for a week, she was soon able to make a voluntary transition to the oddities of her cousin, and to point him out to her particular notice. The first two dances, however, brought a return of distress. They were dances of mortification. Mr. Collins, awkward and solemn, apologising instead of attending, and often moving wrong without being aware of it, gave her all the shame and misery which a disagreeable partner for a couple of dances can give. The moment of her release from him was ecstasy. She danced next with an officer, and had the refreshment of talking of Wickham, and of hearing that he was universally liked. When those dances were over, she returned to Charlotte Lucas, and was in conversation with her, when she found herself suddenly addressed by Mr. Darcy, who took her so much by surprise in his application for her hand, that, without knowing what she did, she accepted him. He walked away again immediately, and she was left to fret over her own want of presence of mind. Charlotte tried to console her. "I dare say you will find him very agreeable." "Heaven forbid! That would be the greatest misfortune of all, to find a man agreeable whom one is determined to hate. Do not wish me such an evil." When the dancing recommenced, however, and Darcy approached to claim her hand, Charlotte could not help cautioning her in a whisper not to be a simpleton, and allow her fancy for Wickham to make her appear unpleasant in the eyes of a man 10 times his consequence. Elizabeth made no answer, and took her place in the set, amazed at the dignity to which she was arrived in being allowed to stand opposite to Mr. Darcy, and reading in her neighbour's looks her equal amazement in beholding it. They stood for some time without speaking a word, and she began to imagine that their silence was to last through the 2 dances, and at first was resolved not to break it, till suddenly fancying that it would be the greater punishment to her partner to oblige him to talk, she made some slight observation on the dance. He replied, and was again silent. After a pause of some minutes, she addressed him a second time with, "It is your turn to say something now, Mr. Darcy. I talked about the dance, and you ought to make some sort of remark on the size of the room, or the number of couples." He smiled and assured her that whatever she wished him to say should be said. "Very well, that reply will do for the present. Perhaps by and by I may observe that private balls are much pleasanter than public ones, but now we may be silent." "Do you talk by rule, then, while you are dancing?" "Sometimes. One must speak a little, you know. It would look odd to be entirely silent for half an hour together. And yet, for the advantage of some, conversation ought to be so arranged as that they may have the trouble of saying as little as possible." "Are you consulting your own feelings in the present case, or do you imagine that you are gratifying mine?" "Both," replied Elizabeth archly, "for I have always seen a great similarity in the turn of our minds. We are each of an unsocial, taciturn disposition, unwilling to speak unless we expect to say something that will amaze the whole room, and be handed down to posterity with all the éclat of a proverb." I am going to look up that French word. Éclat. A brilliant successful effect, brilliance of success or effort, splendor, brilliant show, striking effect, glory, renown. Éclat. "This is no very striking resemblance of your own character, I am sure," said he. "How near it may be to mine, I cannot pretend to say. You think it a faithful portrait, undoubtedly. I must not decide on my own performance." He made no answer, and they were again silent till they had gone down the dance, when he asked her if she and her sisters did not very often walk to Meryton. She answered in affirmation, and, unable to resist the temptation, added, "When you met us, sir, the other day, we had just been forming a new acquaintance." The effect was immediate. A deeper shade of hauteur. I'll look that one up as well. Haughtiness or arrogance, loftiness. deeper shade of hauteur overspread his features, but he said not a word, and Elizabeth, before blaming herself for her own weakness, could not go on. At length Darcy spoke, and in a constrained manner said, "Mr. Wickham is blessed with such happy manners as may ensure his making friends. Whether he... my apologies. Mr. Wickham is blessed with such happy manners as may ensure his making friends. Whether he may be equally capable of retaining them is less certain. He has been so unlucky as to lose your friendship," replied Elizabeth with emphasis, "and in a manner which he is likely to suffer from all his life." Darcy made no answer, and seemed desirous of changing the subject. At that moment Sir William Lucas appeared close to them, meaning to pass through the set to the other side of the room. On perceiving Mr. Darcy, he stopped with a bow of superior courtesy to compliment him on his dancing and his partner. "I have been most highly gratified indeed, my dear sir. Such very superior dancing is not often seen. It is evident that you belong to the first circles. Allow me to say, however, that your fair partner does not disgrace you, and I must hope to have this pleasure often repeated, especially when a certain desirable event, my dear Eliza," glancing at her sister and Bingley, "shall take place." What congratulations will then flow in. I appeal to Mr. Darcy, but let me not interrupt you, sir. You will not thank me for detaining you from the bewitching converse of that young lady, whose bright eyes are also upbraiding me. The later part of this address was scarcely heard by Darcy, but Sir William's allusion to his friend seemed to strike him forcibly, and his eyes were directed with a very serious expression towards Bingley and Jane, who were dancing together. Recovering himself, however, shortly, he turned to his partner and said, "Sir William's interruption has made me forget what we were talking of." "I do not think we were speaking at all. Sir William could have interrupted two people in the room who had less to say for themselves. Sir William could not have interrupted two people in the room who had less to say for themselves. We have tried 2 or 3 subjects already without success, and what we are to talk of next I cannot imagine." "What think you of books?" said he, smiling. "Books? Oh, no. I'm sure we never read the same, or not with the same feelings." "I'm sorry you think so, but if that be the case, there can at least be of no want of subject. We may compare our different opinions." "No, I cannot talk of books in the ballroom. My head is always full of something." "The present always accompanies you in such scenes, does it?" said he, with a look of doubt. "Yes, always," she replied, without knowing what she said, for her thoughts had wandered far from the subject, as soon afterwards appeared by suddenly exclaiming, "I remember hearing you once say, Mr. Darcy, that you hardly ever forgave, that your resentment once created was unappeasable. You're very courteous, I suppose, as to its being created." "Oh, You're very cautious, I suppose, as to its being created." "I am," said he, with a firm voice. "And never allow yourself to be blinded by prejudice?" "I hope not." "It is particularly incumbent on those who never change their opinion to be secure of judging properly at first. May I ask to what these questions tend?" "Merely to the illustration of your characters," said she, endeavouring to shake off her gravity. "I'm trying to make it out." "And what is your success?" She shook her head. "I do not get on at all. I hear such different accounts of you as puzzle me exceedingly." "I can readily believe," answered he gravely, "that reports may vary greatly with respect to me, and I could wish, Mr. Bennet, that you were not to sketch my character at the present moment, and there is no reason to fear that the performance would reflect no credit on either. But if I do not take your likeness now, I may never have another opportunity. I would by no means suspend any pleasures of yours," he calmly replied. She said no more, and they went down the other dance and parted in silence, on each side dissatisfied, though not to an equal degree, for in Darcy's breast there was a tolerable powerful feeling towards her, which soon procured her pardon, and directed all his anger against another. They had not long separated when Miss Bingley came towards her, with an expression of civil disdain, accosted her. "So, Miss Eliza, I hear you are quite delighted with George Wickham. Your sister has been talking to me about him, and asking me 1,000 questions, and I find that the young man quite forgot to tell you, among his other communication, that he was the son of old Wickham, the late Mr. Darcy's steward. Let me recommend you, however, as a friend, not to give implicit confidence to all his assertions, for as to Mr. Darcy's using him ill, it is perfectly false, for, on the contrary, he has always been remarkably kind to him, though George Wickham has treated Mr. Darcy in a most infamous manner. I do not know the particulars, but I know very well that Mr. Darcy is not in the least to blame, that he cannot bear to hear George Wickham mentioned, and though my brother thought that he could not well avoid including him in his invitation to the officers, he was excessively glad to find that he had taken himself out of the way. His coming into the country at all is a most insolent thing, indeed, and I wonder how he could presume to do it. I pity you, Miss Eliza, for the discovery of your favourite's guilt. Really, considering his descent, one could not expect much better. His guilt and his descent appear by your account to be the same, said Eliza angrily, for I have heard you accuse him of nothing worse than of being the son of Mr. Darcy's steward, and of that, I can assure you, he informed me himself. I beg your pardon, Miss Bingley replied, turning away with a sneer. Excuse my interference. It was kindly meant. Insolent girl, said Elizabeth to herself. You are much mistaken if you expect to influence me by such a paltry attack at this. I see nothing in it but your own wilful ignorance and malice of Mr. Darcy. I see nothing in it but your own wilful ignorance and the malice of Mr. Darcy. She then sought her eldest sister, who had undertaken to make inquiries on the same subject of Bingley. Jane met her with a smile of such sweet complacency, a glow of such happy expression, as sufficiently marked how well she was satisfied with the occurrences of the evening. Elizabeth instantly read her feelings, and at the moment solicitude for Wickham, resentment against his enemies, and everything else gave way before the hope of Jane's being in the fairest way for happiness. I want to know, said she, with her countenance no less smiling than her sister's, what you have learnt about Mr. Wickham. Perhaps you have been too pleasantly engaged to think of any third person, in which case you may be sure of my pardon. No, replied Jane, I have not forgotten him, but I have nothing satisfactory to tell you. Mr. Bingley does not know the whole of his history, and she is quite ignorant of the circumstances which have principally offended Mr. Darcy, but he will vouch for the good conduct, the probity, and the honour of his friend, and is perfectly convinced that Mr. Wickham has deserved much less attention from Mr. Darcy than he has received. I am sorry to say, by his account, as well as his sister's, Mr. Wickham is by no means a respectable young man. I am afraid he has been very imprudent, and deserved to lose Mr. Darcy's regard. Probity. I'm sure I've looked that up on the stream before, but I'm going to do so again. Oh, I do apologise. Jenny Jenny left a comment earlier. What does that mean? Making friends, retaining them. Why he can make friends easy, but not to retain them. I think that was an allusion by Mr. Darcy, suggesting that because Mr. Wickham had such good manners, he found it very easy and quick to make friends, but that due to him being not a very nice person, he couldn't keep them, which was Mr. Darcy's opinion. Property, integrity, especially quality of having strong moral principles, decency and honesty. So, I am afraid he has been very imprudent. I apologise, for some reason I can't seem to say that word today. I'm afraid he has been very imprudent, and has deserved to lose Mr. Darcy's regard. Mr. Bingley does not know Mr. Wickham himself. No, he has never saw him till the other morning at Meryton. This account, then, is what he has received from Mr. Darcy. I am satisfied, but what does he say of the living? He does not exactly recollect the circumstances. He has heard them from Mr. Darcy more than once, but he believes that it was left to him conditionally only. I have not a doubt of Mr. Bingley's sincerity, said Elizabeth warmly, but you must excuse my not being convinced by the assurances only. Mr. Bingley's defence of his friend was not a very able one, I dare say, but since he is unacquainted with several parts of the story, and has learnt the rest from that friend himself, I shall venture to still think of both gentlemen as I did before. She then changed the discourse to one more gratifying to each, and on which there could be no difference of sentiment. Elizabeth listened with delight to the happy, though modest hopes which Jane entertained of Mr. Bingley's regard, and did all in her power to heighten her confidence in it. On their being joined by Mr. Bingley himself, Elizabeth withdrew to Miss Lucas, to whose inquiry after the pleasantness of her last partner she had scarcely replied, before Mr. Collins came up to them and told her with great exultation that he had been so fortunate as to make a most important discovery. "I have found out," said he, "by a singular accident that there is now in the room a near relation of my patroness. I happened to overhear the gentleman himself mentioning to the young lady who does the honours of the house with the names of his cousin, Mr. Burr, and of her mother, Lady Catherine. How wonderfully these sorts of things occur! Who would have thought of my meeting with perhaps a nephew of Lady Catherine de Burgh in this assembly? I am most thankful that discovery is made in time for me to pay my respects to him, which I am now going to do, and trust you will excuse my not having done it before. My total ignorance of the connection must plead my apology." "You're not going to introduce yourself to Mr. Darcy?" "Indeed I am. I shall entreat his pardon for not having done it earlier. I believe him to be Lady Catherine's nephew. It will be in my power to assure him that her ladyship was quite well yesterday's night." Elizabeth tried hard to dissuade him from such a scheme, assuring him that Mr. Darcy would consider his addressing him without introduction as impertinent freedom, rather than a compliment to his aunt, though it was not in the least necessary there should be any notice on either side, and that if it were, it must belong to Mr. Darcy, the superior in consequence, to begin the acquaintance. Mr. Collins listened to her with a determined air of following his own inclination, and when she ceased speaking, replied thus: "My dear Miss Elizabeth, I have the highest opinion in the world in your excellent judgment in all matters within the scope of your understanding, but permit me to say that there must be a wide difference between the established forms of ceremony amongst the laity and those which regulate the clergy. For give me leave to observe that I consider the clerical office as equal in point of dignity with the highest rank in the kingdom, provided that proper humility of behaviour is at the same time maintained. You must therefore allow me to follow the dictates of my conscience on this occasion, which leads me to perform what I look on as a point of duty. Pardon me for neglecting to profit by your advice, which on every other subject shall be my constant guide, though in the case before us I consider myself more fitted by education and habitual study to decide on what is right than a young lady like yourself." With a low bow he left her to attack Mr. Darcy, whose reception of his advances she eagerly watched, and his astonishment at being so addressed was very evident. Her cousin prefaced his speech with a solemn bow, and though she could not hear a word of it, she felt as if hearing it all, and saw in the motion of his lips the words apology, Hunsford, and Lady Catherine de Burgh. It vexed her to see him expose himself to such a man. Mr. Darcy was eyeing him with unrestrained wonder, and when at last Mr. Collins allowed him time to speak, replied with an air of distant civility. Mr. Collins, however, was not discouraged from speaking again, and Mr. Darcy's contempt seemed abundantly increasing with the length of his second speech. At the end of it he only made him a slight bow and moved another way. Mr. Collins then returned to Elizabeth. "I have no reason, I assure you," said he, "to be dissatisfied with my reception. Mr. Darcy seemed much pleased with the attention. He answered me with the utmost civility, and even paid me the compliment of saying he was so well convinced of Lady Catherine's discernment as to be certain she could never bestow a favour unworthily. It was really a very handsome thought. Upon the whole, I am much pleased with him." As Elizabeth no longer had any interest of her own to pursue, she turned her attention almost entirely on her sister and Mr. Bingley, and the train of agreeable reflections which her observations gave birth to made her perhaps almost as happy as Jane. She saw her in idea settled in that very house. Sorry, I don't quite follow that. She saw in her idea settled in that very house. Nope, I'm still not understanding that for some reason. She saw in her idea settled in that very house in all the felicity which a marriage of true affection could bestow, and she felt capable, under such circumstances, of endeavouring even to like Bingley's two sisters. Her mother's thoughts, she plainly saw, were bent the same way, and she determined not to venture near her, lest she might hear too much. When they sat down to supper, therefore, she considered it a most unlucky perverseness which placed them with When they sat down to supper, therefore, she considered a most unlucky perverseness which placed them within one of each other, and deeply was she vexed to find that her mother was talking to that one person, Lady Lucas, freely, openly, and of nothing else but her expectation that Jane would soon be married to Mr. Bingley. It was an animating subject, and Mrs. Bennet seemed incapable of fatigue while enumerating the advantages of the match. His being such a charming young man, and so rich, and living but 3 miles from them, were the first points of self-gratulation, and then it was such a comfort to think how fond the 2 sisters were of Jane, and to be certain that they must desire the connection as much as she could. It was moreover such a promising thing for her younger daughters, as Jane's marrying so greatly must throw them in the way of other rich men. And lastly, it was so pleasant at her time of life to be able to consign her single daughters to the care of their sister, that she might be obliged to go into company more than she liked. It was necessary to make this circumstance a matter of pleasure, because on such occasions it is the etiquette. But no one was less likely than Mrs. Bennet to find comfort in staying at home at any period of her life. She concluded with many good wishes that Lady Lucas might soon be equally fortunate, though evidently and triumphantly believing there was no chance of it. In vain did Elizabeth endeavour to check the rapidity of her mother's words, or persuade her to describe her felicity in a less audible whisper, for to her inexpressible vexation she could perceive that the chief of it was overheard by Mr. Darcy, who sat opposite to them. Her mother only scolded her for being nonsensical. "What is Mr. Darcy to me, pray, that I should be afraid of him? I am sure we owe him no such particular civility as to be obliged to say nothing he may not like to hear." "For heaven's sake, madam, speak lower. What advantage can it be for you to offend Mr. Darcy? You will never recommend yourself to his friend by so doing." Nothing that she could say, however, had any influence. Her mother would talk of her views in the same intelligible tone. Elizabeth blushed, and blushed again with shame and vexation. She could not help frequently glancing her eye at Mr. Darcy. Though every glance convinced her of what she dreaded. Although he was not always looking at her mother, she was convinced that his attention was invariably fixed by her. The expression of his face changed gradually from indignant contempt to a composed and steady gravity. At length, however, Mrs. Bennet had no more to say, and Lady Lucas, who had been long yawning at the repetition of delights which she saw no likelihood of sharing, was left to the comforts of cold ham and chicken. Elizabeth now began to revive, but not long was the interval of tranquillity, for when supper was over and singing was talked of, she had the mortification of seeing Mary, after very little entreaty, preparing to oblige the company. By many significant looks and silent entreaties did she endeavour to prevent such a proof of complaisance, but in vain. Mary would not understand them. Such an opportunity of exhibiting was delightful to her, and she began her song. Elizabeth's eyes were fixed on her with the most painful sensations, and she watched her progress through the several stanzas with an impatience which was very ill rewarded at their close, for Mary, on receiving, amongst the thanks of the table, the hint of a hope that she might be prevailed on to favour them again, after the pause of half a minute, began another. Mary's powers were by no means fitted for such a display. Her voice was weak, her manner affected. Elizabeth was in agonies. She looked at Jane to see how she bore it, but Jane was very composedly talking to Bingley. She looked at his 2 sisters, and saw them making signs of derision at each other, and at Darcy, who continued, however, imperturbably grave. She looked at her father to entreat his interference, lest Mary should be singing all night. He took the hint, and when Mary had finished the second song, said aloud, "That will do extremely well, child. You have delighted us long enough. Let the other young ladies time to exhibit." Mary, though pretending not to hear, was somewhat disconcerted, and Elizabeth, sorry for her, and sorry for her father's speech, was afraid her anxieties had done no good. Others of the party were now applied to. "If I," said Mr. Collins, "was so fortunate as to be able to sing, I should have great pleasure, I am sure, in obliging the company with an air, for I consider music as a very innocent diversion, and perfectly compatible with the profession of a clergyman. I do not mean, however, to assert that we can be justified in devoting too much of our time to music. There are certainly other things to be attended to. The rector of a parish has much to do. In the first place, he must make such an agreement for tithes as may be beneficial to himself and not offensive to his patron. He must write his own sermons, and the time that remains will not be too much for his parish duties, and the care and improvement of his dwelling, which he cannot be excused from making as comfortable as possible. And I do not think it is of light importance that he should have attentive and conciliatory manners towards everybody, especially towards those to whom he owes his preferment. I cannot acquit him of that duty, nor could I think well of a man who should omit an occasion of testifying his respect towards anybody connected with the family. And with a bow to Mr. Darcy, he concluded his speech, which had been spoken so loud as to be heard by half the room. Many stared, many smiled, but no one looked more amused than Mr. Bennet himself, while his wife seriously commended Mr. Collins for having spoken so sensibly, and observed in a half-whisper to Lady Lucas that he was a remarkably clever, good kind of young man. To Elizabeth it appeared that had her family made an agreement to expose themselves as much as they could during the event, my apologies. To Elizabeth it appeared that had her family made an agreement to expose themselves as much as they could during the evening, it would have been impossible for them to play their parts with more spirit or finer success. And happy did she think it for Bingley and her sister that some of the exhibition and happy did she think it for Bingley and her sister that some of the exhibition had escaped his notice, and that his feelings were not of the sort to be much distressed by the folly which he must have witnessed. That his two sisters and Mr. Darcy, however, should have such an opportunity of ridiculing her relations was bad enough, and she could not determine whether the silent contempt of the gentlemen or the insolent smiles of the ladies were more intolerable. The rest of the evening brought her little amusement. She was teased by Mr. Collins, who continued most perseveringly by her side, and though he could not prevail on her to dance with him again, put it out of her power to dance with others. In vain did she entreat him to stand up with somebody else, and offer to introduce him to any young lady in the room. He assured her that as to dancing he was perfectly indifferent to it, and that his chief object was by delicate attentions to recommend himself to her, and that she should therefore make a point of remaining close to her the whole evening. And that he should therefore make a point of remaining close to her the whole evening. There was no arguing upon such a project. She owed her greatest relief to her friend Miss Lucas, who often joined them, and good-naturedly engaged Mr. Collins' conversation to herself. She was at least free from the offence of Mr. Darcy's further notice, though, often standing within a very short distance of her, quite disengaged, he never came near enough to speak. She felt it to be the probable consequence of her allusions to Mr. Wickham, and rejoiced in it. The Longbourn party were the last of all the company to depart, and by a manoeuvre of Mrs. Bennet had to wait for their carriage a quarter of an hour after everybody else was gone, which gave them time to see how heartily they were wished away by some of the family. Mrs. Hurst and her sister scarcely opened their mouths except to complain of fatigue, and were evidently impatient to have the house to themselves. They repulsed every attempt of Mrs. Bennet at conversation, and by so doing threw a languor over the whole party. I will look that word up. Languor. A state of body or mind caused by exhaustion or disease and characterized by a languid or weary feeling. Languor. They repulsed every attempt of Mrs. Bennet at conversation, and by so doing threw a languor over the whole party, which was very little relieved by the long speeches of Mr. Collins, who was complimenting Mr. Bingley and his sisters on the elegance of their entertainment, and the hospitality and politeness which had marked their behaviour to their guests. Darcy said nothing at all. Mr. Bennet, in equal silence, was enjoying the scene. Mr. Bingley and Jane were standing together, a little detached from the rest, and talked only to each other. Elizabeth perceived as steadily as a silence as either Mrs. Hurst or Miss Bingley, and even Lydia was too much fatigued to utter more than the occasional exclamation of "Lord, how tired I am," accompanied by a violent yawn. When at length they arose to take leave, Mrs. Bennet was most pressingly civil in her hope of seeing the whole family soon at Longbourn, and addressed herself especially to Mr. Bingley to assure him how happy he would make them by eating a family dinner with them at any time, without the ceremony of a formal invitation. Mr. Bingley was all grateful pleasure, and he readily engaged for taking the earliest opportunity of waiting on her. After his return from London, whither he was obliged to go the next day for a short time, Mrs. Bennet was perfectly satisfied, and quitted the house under the delightful persuasion that, allowing for the necessary preparations of settlements, new carriages, and wedding clothes, she should undoubtedly see her daughter settled at Netherfield in the course of 3 or 4 months. Of having another daughter married to Mr. Collins, she thought with equal certainty, and with considerable, though not equal, pleasure. Elizabeth was the least dear to her of all her children, and though the man and the match were quite good enough for her, the worth of each was eclipsed by Mr. Bingley and Netherfield. So, that was chapter 18, I believe. Yep. Is there anything we would like to discuss about that before we move on? If not, then we will continue on to the riddles. I believe the last riddle we had solved was 42. The riddle itself is: there is a certain natural production, neither animal, vegetable, nor mineral. It exists upon the surface of the earth from 2 feet to 6. It is neither male nor female, but between both. It is often mentioned in the Old Testament and strongly recommended in the New. And I believe the solution to that one was supposed to be love, although it didn't entirely make sense to me. Still, I believe that was the answer. So if we move on to 43. A longer one. Fair ladies, the freedom excused, which presumes to desire you'll attend. If you relish these sports of the muse, I hope you'll approve what I've penned. The use that I'm of to the fair is known to both foolish and wise. They employ to attach me great care, and some men to my worthy greatly prize. If I from a fair one should stray, what confusion for her is in store, since my service she seeks all the day, nor without me can stir from her door. My form longitudinal does, when used, a circle produce. My station I must not disclose. When you know me, you'll find my excuse. My size and complexion exceed mechanical powers to explain. From all external ills I am freed, but daily my bondage retain. I am rarely exposed to view, nor will I say to my fame, this favour ye fair I from you require that you tell me my name. seems to me that the answer is probably some form of makeup. I mean, the simplest solution I can think of would be if it be lipstick. But, to be honest, I don't know whether they had sticks of lipstick in Georgian times. I mean, I have no doubt women would have had been colouring their lips. I don't know if that was the fashion in Georgian times. I understand that around late Georgian times there's a great fashion for wearing less makeup, but that's something that changes over time. But what I'm suggesting that historically I have no doubt that colouring the lips at various times and places had been very popular and would have been done. I just don't know whether a lipstick as we would recognise it today had been invented yet or not. Jenny suggested it could be a garter. That's a reasonable guess. Is a garter a tight? A band worn around the leg to hold up a sock or stocking. Not quite then. Okay. That's my mistake. Fair ladies, the freedom excuse, which presumes to desire you'll attend. If you relish these sports of the muse, I hope you'll approve what I've penned. The use that I'm off to the fair is known to both foolish and wise. They employ to attach me great care, and some men to my worthy greatly prize. And some men to my worth greatly prize. If I from a fair one should stray, what confusion for her is in store, since my service she seeks all the day, nor without me can stir from her door. My form longitudinal does, when used a circle produce. My station I must not disclose, when you know me you'll find my excuse. My size and complexion exceed mechanical powers to explain. From all external ills I am freed, but daily my bondage retain. I'm rarely exposed to view, nor will I say to my fame, this favour, ye fair I from you, require that you tell me my name. It probably is a garter, that makes more sense, especially with the line, but daily my bondage retain. So, let's see if that's the answer. 42 was indeed love, and 43 is garter. Well done, Jenny. What was the page we were on? There we are. Jenny says it tightens the socks, I guess. I think it helps hold them on. So that was 43. 44. Dressed in the gayest form I oft appear, to please the fancy of the blooming fair, whom I to church, the ball and play attend, their lovely eyes from folly to defend, gay youths oft wish that they like me could sip the balmy nectar of a fair one's lip, but I, still watchful of my lovely charge, prevent our eyes from roving out at large. Surely such service at least might claim, that from oblivion they should snatch my name. Alas, a different fate attends her slave, when born with age, though still with honour brave, I'm cast neglected by, perhaps in scorn, to the hot flames my tender limbs are borne. Can cruel acts like this become the fair, to those who guard them with a mother's care? So this also sounds like either an item of makeup or a item of a lady's wardrobe, I would suggest. Dressed in the gayest form I oft appear, to please the fancy of the blooming fair, whom I to church, the ball and play attend, their lovely eyes from folly to defend, gay youths oft wish that they like me could sip the balmy nectar of a fair one's lip, but I, still watchful of my lovely charge, prevent her eyes from roving out at large. Surely such service at least might claim, that from oblivion they should snatch my name. Alas, a different fate attends their slave. When worn with age, though still with honour brave, I'm cast neglected by, perhaps in scorn, to the hot flames my tender limbs are borne. Can cruel acts like this become the fare to those who guard them with a mother's care? Could it be a veil? I don't think veils were commonly worn to church balls and plays, though. But that would certainly cover one's lips. Eyes still watchful of my lovely charge, prevent our eyes from roving out at large. That's it. I mean, you could take that as implying that it's literally obscuring their vision, but I can't think of anything that would do that a lady might be wearing at this point. Jenny suggested a fan. That's not a bad guess. I'd considered that too. But no, you're right, they did have fans at this point, didn't they? I was thinking that was more of an Asian nobility thing, but no, I'm fairly certain we would have also had fans. Probably quite ornate ones. Yes, that makes a lot of sense. And it is in fact a fan, well done. Sorry, I'm a bit lost. There we go, that's where we should be. Read Exodus, you'll plainly see what wonders have been wrought by me, when in a holy mortal's hand more power I had than sorcerer's wand. More power I had than sorcerer's wand. King Solomon well knew my worth, as in his writings he set forth, to moderns, to my uses known. Much good I've done to them they'll own, when promises nor threats avail, my arguments scarce ever fail, and when employed I clear the skull, and drain off all that makes it dull. Thus I such in my art in fine, make blockheads clever, dunces shine. I'll read that once more. Read Exodus, you'll plainly see what wonders have been wrought by me, when in holy mortal's hand more power I had than sorcerer's wand. King Solomon well knew my worth, in his writings he set forth, to moderns too my uses known. But much good I've done to them then they'll own, when promises nor threats avail, my arguments scarce ever fail, and when employed I clear the skull, and drain off all that makes it dull. Thus I such in my art in fine, make blockheads clever, dunces shine. Writing? Literature? I wonder why Exodus in particular. I mean, Moses was brought up in the palace of the Pharaoh, whereas the rest of the Jews were slaves. So he would have had an education. Education. Could the answer just be education? That's my best guess. Would anyone else like to make a guess? I suppose not. So let's see if the answer is education. A rod? I do not understand. I wonder what the connection to rods and Exodus is. Do they mean a rod in the sense of beating? An implement resembling or supplanting planting a rod, particularly a cane that is used for corporal punishment, and metonymically called the rod, regardless of its actual shape and composition. The judge imposed on the thief a sentence of 15 strokes with the rod. Yes, this is making more sense now. And I'm sorry to say, where it says, make blockheads clever, dunces shine, I believe they're talking about referring to beating children in school. Because, of course, it was the culture for a very long time that children would be would receive corporal punishment while being educated. So I suppose the idea being that, they'll be so afraid of getting hurt that they'll apply themselves well and learn. That also figures with Exodus because of the slaves of the Pharaoh, the Jews, who would have been beaten, I'm sure. So read Exodus, you'll plainly see what wonders have been wrought by me, when in a holy mortal's hand, more power I've had than a sorcerer's wand. King Solomon knew well my worth, and in his writings he set forth, to moderns too my use is known, much good I've done to them they'll own. When promises nor threats avail, my arguments scarce ever fail, and when employed I clear the skull and drain off all that makes it dull. Oof. Thus I, such in my art in fine, make blockheads clever, dunces shine. So yeah, that makes sense. It's a bit, not really to modern tastes, but it makes sense. 46. Ye who have genius, tell my name. Twin born into the world I came, I generally am found in pairs, which male as well as female bears. If single without fault in nature, my name dominates a creature. I first of all defend my parents from noisy mob and their adherents. But when I boldly fight and wound, I'm destitute of voice and sound. Oft as my parents I survive, I wondrous use from them derive. I them am plainly heard from far, loud as an instrument of war. Oft I am placed in public station, or general negotiation, with all matters circulate, in city, country, church, or state, to my persuasions numbers yield, and at my summons take the field. When cheered by me, they best sustain the toil and danger of the plain. This done, I silent service give, and troops fatigue through me revive. When I refreshment kind impart, and with long droughts regale the heart. When sinking Phobos yields to night, and stars diffuse but feeble light, then I transmit a borrowed ray, and kindly darkness into day. And kindle darkness into day. Sometimes I cover the foundation of all the learning in the nation. Now to conclude, fair ladies, ye contribute towards producing me. Some of it makes me wonder if the answer could be the eyes, but other parts of it don't. You who have genius, tell my name. Twin born into the world I came. I'm generally am found in pairs, which male as well as female bears. That's certainly true of the eyes. If single without fault in nature, my name dominates a creature. Because it would be a cyclops. I first of all defend my parents from noisy mob and their adherents. What do I mean by my parents? But when I boldly fight and wound, I'm destitute of voice and sound. Oft as my parents I survived, I wondrous use from them derive. I then am plainly heard from far, loud as an instrument of war, often placed in public station, of general negotiation, of all matters circulate in city, country, church or state, to my persuasions numbers yield, and at my summons take the field. When cheered by me they best sustain the toil and danger of the plain. This done I silent service give, and troops fatigues through me revive. When I refreshment kind impart, and with long dress regale the heart. When sinking Phobos yields to night, and stars diffuse but feeble light, then I transmit a borrowed ray, and kindle darkness into day. Well, that could be eyes as well, but a lot of this doesn't make sense. Sometimes I cover the foundation of all the learning in the nation. Now to conclude, fair ladies, ye contribute towards producing me. I mean, I suppose a baby's eyes are formed inside the mother. But a lot of it doesn't figure with that. I first of all defend my parents from noisy mob and their adherents. That doesn't figure with eyes in any way I can work out. But when I boldly fight and wound, I'm destitute of voice and sound. That kind of makes sense. You know, giving someone a look to wound them or to show rebelliousness would be still destitute of voice and sound. Oft as my parents I survive, I wondrous use from them derive. I then am plainly heard from far, loud as an instrument of war. That doesn't make sense. Oft am I placed in public station of general negotiation. Again, with me all matters circulate in city, country, church or state. Sorta makes sense. To my persuasions numbers yield, and at my summons take the field. Maybe, sort of, ish. When cheered by me, they best sustain the toil and danger of the plain. This done I silent service give, and troops fatigue through me revive. When I refreshment kind impart, and with long draughts regale the heart. Eyes is the best I can think of, but it doesn't make a lot of this doesn't make sense. Any other ideas? I suppose not. Yes, Jenny suggested horns. I think I mentioned that before, but if I didn't, then I'm not convinced by horns. Because again, that doesn't... I mean, I suppose it would make sense with the name. The whole naming thing and a unicorn. But females don't... Well, it depends what species of animal you're talking about, but females of many species don't have horns. Or if they do, they're much smaller than the males. I suppose they still have them in some cases. But it doesn't really make sense. First of all, defend my parents from noisy mob and their terrants. Admittedly, that doesn't make sense with eyes either. But then you have lines like, when sinking Phobos yields to night, and stars diffuse but feeble light, then I transmit a borrowed ray, and kindle darkness into day. That makes sense with eyes, but not with horns. So, I'm not convinced. But it is in fact horns. Okay, well done, Jenny. I suppose that kind of makes sense of surviving your parents, because the horns won't decompose, and then they could be used to craft a weapon. Often placed in public station of general negotiation, with me all matters circulate in city, country, church or state. I don't see how that makes sense with horns. I suppose a drinking horn makes some sense with the, like, reviving troops. Sometimes I cover the foundation of all the learning in the nation. I don't understand it. Unfortunately. Can you explain it, Jenny? Jenny says noisy and in pairs. That still doesn't figure to me. Still, let's try the next one. How long is this? Okay. Let it be known, I boast celestial birth, though oft I fix my residence on earth. In paradise I once was known to dwell, ere the first pair by disobedience fell. But when the horrors of their guilt they knew, from the sad spot precipitate I flew. Once by a virtuous prince I was possessed, and lived the sovereign of his breast. But now, alas, at courts I'm seldom found. My dearest foes usurp that sinful ground. Like Noah's dove I range the world's vast space, alike perplexed to find a resting place. My sex is feminine, or poet's fame. I wear a placid and engaging mane. I'm gentle, mild, benevolent, sincere, and where I dwell diffusive smiles appear. All vice I hate and malice I despise. I never am found but with the good and wise. Take one hint more that may be my name disclose. Take one hint more that may my name disclose. I heighten joys and soften human woes. The reference to being at a sovereign's breast makes me wonder if it could be a flower, but it also makes me wonder if it's a particular type of flower, such as one that's associated with purity or something. Let it be known I boast celestial birth, though oft I fix my residence on earth. In paradise I once was known to dwell, ere the first pair by disobedience fell. But when the horrors of their guilt they knew, from the sad spot precipitate I flew. Once by a virtuous prince I was possessed, and left the sovereign of his breast. But now, alas, at courts I'm seldom found. My direst foes usurp that sinful ground. Like Noah's dove I range the world's vast space, alike perplexed to find a resting place. My sex is feminine, or poet's vain. I wear a placid and engaging mien. I'm gentle, mild, benevolent, and sincere, and where I dwell to few smiles appear. All vice I hate, and malice I despise. I never am found but with the good and wise. Take one hint more that may my name disclose. I heighten joys and soften human woes. Jenny says, and what about you treat horns as a means of communication? I suppose a horn that would make some sense with the army, as in a horn for giving orders in battle, but a lot of it still doesn't make sense to me. Music. Music? Let it be known I boast celestial birth, though oft I fix my residence on earth. In paradise I once was known to dwell, ere the first pair by disobedience fell. But when the horrors of their guilt they knew, from the sad spot precipitate I flew. Once by a virtuous prince I was possessed, and left the sovereign of his breast. But now, alas, at courts I'm seldom found. My direst foes usurp that sinful ground. Like Noah's dove I range the world's vast space, alike perplexed to find a resting place. My sex is feminine, or poet's vain. I wear a placid and engaging mien. I'm gentle, mild, benevolent, sincere, and where I dwell diffusive smiles appear. All vice I hate, and malice I despise, and never am found but with the good and wise. To take one hint more that may my name disclose, I heighten joys and soften human woes. No, that doesn't quite figure. I don't think they'd have associated music as being as hating vice and malice necessarily. Jenny suggested it could be plea-sing. Well, that would make the last bit make some sense. I heighten joys, plea. Is that what plea does? And soften human woes, sing. Oh, I don't know. Let's see if that is the answer. Innocence. That makes perfect sense, in a sense. Oh, I like that one. That's a little more I appreciate the cleverness in that one. Anyway, I think we'll stop there for tonight. So I will be streaming again on Friday, in which I will be continuing my playthrough of Black Skylands. Although that stream will be later than usual because I'll be returning from my grandparents. I can't be sure what time I'll get back, so it might be quite late, but that I do intend to go ahead with the Friday stream, but it will be later. Saturday, again, it's likely I'll stream, in which case it'll be more Black Skylands at the usual time of 4. Then on Monday, I'll be continuing my playthrough of Monkey Island 3, The Curse of Monkey Island. And then back to Wednesday, it will be back to this stream, Poetry, Prose and Riddles. Jenny says, I hope you have a good time with your family. Thank you, Jenny. And thank you to everyone that's come to watch this stream. I do appreciate it. I wish you all a good night. Good night.